Vocation is something that I've thought a lot about. I feel like I've been trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do with my life for a lot of my life. Last year, I left my job at Penn to really try to give a little bit more urgency to that question for myself. So it's been something that I've spent the past few months thinking a lot about and learning a lot about. I think we have weird ideas about vocation in our culture. A lot of people, when they think of vocation, naturally think about the job that you do. So we primarily think about it in terms of like economic activity that we do like in a workplace. Traditionally, vocation has been thought about more in terms of who you are and less about what you do. The word vocation, the root Latin word vocare, means to call. So we think of that as a synonym for vocation a lot of times. I actually think it's probably a better word to use because we have kind of weird ideas about vocation. But I think also when we think about it in terms of call, it helps us to see get a little bit more creativity in terms of how we see ways that we're being called to be a certain kind of person or live a certain kind of life in a lot of different areas of our life. The idea of vocation was originally worked out in the Middle Ages, which was this period when Christians were really contending with the reality of Christ's resurrection and trying to seek out basically how the pattern of Christ's resurrection could be implemented in everyday life, which probably is the most positive take you'll hear in the Middle Ages, or maybe one of the most positive takes you'll hear in the Middle Ages. But they saw vocation basically as being expressed in three different ways. So there's three options for vocation. The first was to become a priest. The second was to become a monk or a nun. And the third was to get married. So those were the three vocations that someone could have in their life. It doesn't totally reflect how we live today, but I think there's some important things that we can look at in terms of understanding the idea of Christian vocation, how we practice it. And really the commonality between the three was they saw vocation as the arena of life where you were imitating Christ, where you were being like Christ. So in marriage, it's about no longer serving yourself, but serving someone else and giving up your own needs for the sake of someone else. And that was a reflection of Christ in your life. The priest, in a very really literal way or mythic way, reenacted the self-giving of Christ when he officiated at the Mass, and also as he cared for the needs of the people. And then finally, the monk, I think, in a very graphic way, literally renounced everything in order to find Christ. I think there's a few things that we can note about this idea of vocation. The first is that it is really a call to be Christ-like, and like I said before, it's not about excelling at a job or being really good at a skill that you can get paid for. It's primarily about becoming a kind of person. The second is that it's also a way in which we discover who we are as people, where we recover our own humanity. There's kind of this really delightful paradox in Christian theology, this idea that in Christ God shows us the face of God, but he also shows us the face of humanity, and in a very specific way shows us our own face. So the call that we're living into is really a call to, you might say, find our true self. And the third thing I think we can note is that our life becomes the context in which this process of being like Christ, of finding our true self, takes place. It's not just a thought experiment. It's not just something that's an idea that we have. The substance of it is the actual decisions that we make, the way that we face situations, the way that we live out our relationships. This is really the place where who we are is revealed to us. And I'm thinking about Viktor Frankl, who was a Jewish psychiatrist living in Vienna in the 1930s, and like many other Jews living in that time and that place, was taken by the Nazis and was sent to a concentration camp. He wrote about his experience there in a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks about being in this situation where, if you look at it from the outside, everything is done basically to limit the freedom and dehumanize the people in the concentration camp. And he had this realization that, well, first of all, he realized that there were actually lots of opportunities, even in that situation, to exercise freedom and choice. But even if there weren't, he realized that he was still left with the ability to decide how he was going to face his suffering, even how he was going to face his death. And it was in finding that freedom that he found the path to restoring his sense of humanity, his sense of dignity, so that even though he was losing the battle for existence, there was still a battle for his humanity that could be fought. Obviously, most of us won't experience something like that. We can still find opportunities to make our circumstances a matter of intention, to bring a sense of resolve to the decisions we make. And that really is the way that we encounter the freedom of Christ in our daily life, is looking for those opportunities to take some responsibility for the way that we live. I didn't really have time to talk about the kind of other part of vocation, which is maybe the more exciting part, which is really where you think about the way in which you dream about the ways that you can creatively express your gifts. I think that's really important as well. I think even alongside that is this idea of call being something that's common to everybody, and something that wherever we are, whatever situation in life we're in, we can still look for those ways in which we're called to relate in a new way, or even take on a sense of responsibility for the way that we live.